Welcome to the show. This is the show where we go upstream from politics and all kinds of squabbles to the source of where things matter. That's right, culture. I want to jump right in with this. Modern science can say countless true things about you, about the sort of creature you are, about how your parts work, about where you came from. But the very success of modern science can tempt us to believe that its questions are the only questions, that its answers are the only answers, that there's no more to say about you or the natural world than what science can say. Since the infancy of modern science, certain thinkers and writers have succumbed to this temptation and taken it upon themselves to tell us that science is simply the whole truth about us, unquote. Those are not my words. Those are the words of my guest in this episode. It's from his new book called The Immortal In You, How Human Nature is More Than Science Can Say. Michael Augros teaches at Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California, holds a PhD in philosophy from Boston College. He's also the author of Who Designed the Designer? Today we're going to have so much fun digging into this important book, which I was very happy to blurb for Ignatius Press. Michael Augros, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Patrick. Great to be here.
I just came off an Ed Feser bender about proving God's existence. And so we're kind of, we're starting a bit either with a caboose or with one of the train cars after talking about the engine. This book, The Immortal In You, was such a fun ride as a reader. I mean, I'm not crazy about the phrase page turner, but the page is turned. How did the idea for the book arise? Where did you come up with the idea of really drilling deep into the question of the scientism or the materialist version of the human person is inadequate to describe all of us? And of course, you're slowly angling toward the soul and the immortal element of the human person that makes him different from Coco, Jane Goodall's monkey.
Right, yeah. Well, a lot of things really drove me to write the book, but one of them is just that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, David Barish, or David Barash, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, he's a professor he says he gives his students the talk every year. He's a biology teacher. Well, actually, He teaches biology, but I think he's got a psychology background. Anyway, but his idea is to explain to students that they grew up thinking that God and the soul on the one hand and evolution on the other can be friends, and he wants to explain to them that's just simply not true, and They have to choose. I'm not going to force you to choose, but you have to choose. And that's becoming more and more common, that you send your kids off to get an undergrad degree somewhere, and for some reason the universities think it's their job to instill in your kids a kind of modern materialist outlook on life and to cure of religion. So I think it's the case now. You just mentioned Ed Feser. I think he's kind of an example of what I'm about to talk about. Yeah. Philosophers can't really just sit back and do their philosophy in private anymore. They have to come out and answer these things. People like Richard Dawkins are very successful, very influential, very popular, very persuasive. And the thing about the soul in particular is, as opposed to God, you were just mentioning, our own souls are things we actually have experience of all the time. They're the source of life in us, of ordinary living activities like seeing and hearing and talking and thinking and so on. So because of the closeness of that to our experience, I find it particularly frustrating that we've got people telling us that we're nothing but machines, we're nothing but animals, things of that sort, when the evidence that goes contrary to that is directly in our experience of ourselves from day to day to day.
But isn't part of the problem is we're not used to taking that self-referential peek within. We just read things externally, and we take the word of people like Bill Nye. Who is the science guy? I mean, he's called the science guy. He has to be right, and he wears a cardigan and a bow tie. But Bill Nye and his ilk sell us the idea that we're just charming pieces of electric meat, right?
Yes,
just random mutations of billions of years of evolution. And yet, one of the parts of your book that I enjoyed reading and rereading the most, Michael, is what Thomas Aquinas called the common sense, which now has a different meaning in English. But the idea of, well, look, if you look at an apple, it's red, the sky is blue, and yet somehow we're able to transcend our five senses and make sense of the five senses and their relationship to each other. So the sense of smell and touch and hearing and so on are all coordinated by a higher intelligence. It's a kind of an organizing intellect above the sensible data that we get through our senses. Now, where'd that come from? I don't know how a materialist would answer that question.
Yeah, and the point of that particular illustration in the book was just to show the kind of thing that you were mentioning a moment ago, that people have been trained out of taking their own experience of themselves seriously. So early in the book, before getting into anything like the immateriality of the human intellect, I just wanted to show an illustration of how your reflection on your ordinary experience can reveal things about you that are not ordinarily known to people. So that comes right out of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, which you were talking about, that particular interior sense power. But I think it's true that people have been cowed into thinking the only statements that can be made about them in any rigorous way and that are reliable truths about themselves, they have to be made by experts that are looking at you with equipment. It has to be through a kind of a specialized observation of cells or whatever, looking at DNA and trying to piece together how we evolved. Only people like that can say things about authoritative and true. Your own experience of yourself has to be dismissed. It's of no importance.
Right, yeah. Even though it's direct and firsthand.
Yeah, and in fact relied upon in every single science. So that's the thing about that, yeah.
That's the irony of the claim of scientism, isn't it? It can't show, it's almost like science's version of sola scriptura. Where in the scientific method is it taught that science alone exhausts the truth about the human person?
That's an excellent comparison, actually. So you can't find that in the methods of science, that they require that this be the only method. That's actually a philosophical assumption that's tacked on, and that's no part of science. There's no need to say such a thing.
Let's get to some brass tacks off the top. What distinguishes the human person from our most intelligent primate, or let's say dolphin? I had a friend once say, if dolphins are so brilliant, where are their cities, right?
Yeah, right.
So Jane Goodall with her ape, Coco, made a big splash a generation ago, I suppose. We read all the time that primates are super intelligent, that we share a massive majority of DNA information. And you've got a great refutation of that. Because if you don't analyze that information, it sounds, well, yeah, my gosh. I don't know, it's 98, 95, whatever percentage of DNA we share with our primate fellow animals that's supposed to somehow prove that we're like them in kind and in nature. Yeah. I guess with a little more charm, slightly one more layer of charm.
Yeah, you're looking at the material components of us there and saying, since they're 95% the same, or whatever, 99, 98, whatever you go with, therefore we are 95 or 98% the same as them, period. That's kind of like taking, I don't know, a Shakespeare play and a comic book and saying, since the letters they're made out of are 100% the same, therefore these things don't differ, really. They're basically the same kind of literature. There's another problem with that is that DNA is a lot more passive than we might think it is. It's sort of like it encodes a lot of information. It doesn't actually buzz around and do anything with that information. It behaves kind of like a library that's consulted by other parts of the cell. So its real meaning, finally, is kind of contextual. So that code is meaningless apart from being in the context of a cell, which can read that information and make use of it and build things out of it. So anyway, so there's kind of a phony understanding of or an oversimplification of what DNA is involved there. People think that that's just your essence is your DNA.
I wonder if we could throw one more metaphor, and that would be the famous case of a movie critic who writes a review slamming a film, but the filmmakers put one fragment of a sentence of that critique on their poster, and it looks like, quote, ... a great film. But then you read the actual critic says it's not a great film. They just left that one little word off.
Yeah,
even though both are in English, and both are by the same guy. So.
Yeah, so that if you take, it just takes a tiny switch in DNA to change to make the difference between life and death.
Mm-hmm.
So, so unless
Yeah.
you want to say we're essentially the same as a dead thing, which
Yeah.
of course a lot of people would say, but I think finally, though, to answer your original question about what's the difference between us and, say, the most intelligent primates, the most radical difference is that our intelligence is different in kind from theirs because we're able to grasp universal truths, things that are true always and everywhere and that aren't limited in time and place and so on.
Okay,
Things like...
let me press pause there and
Sure.
give me an example of a universal truth. Would that be like, instead of just instead of merely someone acting justly towards someone else, the idea of justice per se?
That would be an example.
Yeah. Or redness independent of an apple?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Or just, I mean, the most obvious examples in a way are mathematical truths because they're the ones that we know with the greatest rigor.
Yeah.
But they're not the only ones like that. But take, for example, truth exists. That's not a mathematical statement. But that's something that we know that's true always and everywhere. It didn't start to be true 10,000 years ago. It's not going to cease to be true. It's impossible for it not to be true. That's the kind of thing that we can know. And it's because of the sort of thing you were saying. We can understand what redness is independently of an apple. We can understand what an animal is independently of a dog or a cat, or what a triangle is independently of an equilateral or isosceles. So we can form universal conceptions that apply to an infinity of possible individuals. And that's the difference between us and really all the other animals. And the sort of, what would you say, an expression of that difference is found in the fact that they don't ask general questions. They don't do that. They're interested in the here and now, maybe in something in the future or the past, but it's always a definite an individual event or thing that they're after. So you never have any indication that they're wondering, for example, hey, is there a biggest number or not? Something that even my kids wonder about. Is there a greatest prime number? Those are things that any normal human being can wonder about. But no animal gives even the slightest inclination, slightest indication that they form ideas like that at all. So, go.
Well, this is an interesting time in which we live, because not only do we have those who argue that we're not really essentially different from primates and other intelligent animals. Now, from the world of technology, we have claims about AI, artificial intelligence. We were speaking off the air that the SoftBank CEO, a guy called Masayoshi Son, he's a Japanese billionaire, and he's investing his lion's share into the artificial intelligence world as a investor. And he says that in about 30 years, artificial intelligence will have an IQ of 10,000. So genius level is something like 200 IQ. Could you say that Deep Blue, the famous computer that beat all those chess champions, can we speak of computers like that and artificial technologies relative to quote unquote intelligence as, well, yeah, they can process massive numbers of numbers faster than the human mind can, but are they on shaky territory talking about literally intelligence quotients as though they're going to be superior to us? Because it seems to me that no matter how many numbers a computer can crunch, no matter how many linguistic tricks it can perform, it has no way of uttering the first person singular. It can't say I in a kind of unified way that masters all the other of its elements. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so one question that I could pick out of that, there's a number of things that you said there, but is there any reason to think that Deep Blue, for example, has awareness of the fact that it's playing chess and beating people, and that it has an interest in doing so? I don't think there's any reason in the world to think that. It is a machine. It's a mechanism. It's a bunch of parts interacting according to rules that were embedded in it. There was a machine, I think, at maybe it was the Boston Museum of Science years ago. It could have been at the MIT Museum, but it was, I'm pretty sure it was made by MIT students, but it was Tinker Toys. That's all it was.
Yeah.
So it was about the size of a room, a small room. It was all made of Tinker Toys and strings, and it could play tic-tac-toe. and it would infallibly win or tie. Basically, that's how it operated. Does that thing know that it's playing tic-tac-toe? Of course not. It doesn't. It's just a bunch of tinker toys. If you build that up, if you beef that up into something that uses electricity instead of just gravity or water, or, you can build a similar thing with water pipes, then it'll operate faster, and it can play much more sophisticated games, accomplish a lot more. But it's the same sort of thing in principle. It's a machine that's getting done a kind of slavish work that we don't want to do ourselves, that we want to farm out to a machine if possible, and it can do better than we can, and that's the whole point of having the machine. But there's no reason to think it has any awareness of what it's doing. So even when you say a machine calculates, say my pocket calculator calculates and I calculate, the word doesn't mean the same thing. In the case of the calculator, it means it's going through a certain set of rules that it's not even aware of. It's just obeying the logic that's built into its parts, and it produces an output. When I calculate, I'm actually trying to understand what the answer is, and I care about the answer. That's a very different thing.
Right. And you're meta aware of what you're doing.
Yeah, but in terms of just the mechanical output, I'm much slower at it, and I'm much more fallible at it, which is why we want the machines.
Yeah, It seems to me the first foray into this idea of artificial intelligence that really gained currency in the culture was the novel from the 40s by Arthur C. Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey, made into the Kubrick movie, with the character HAL 9000, whose calculation about part of the ship was discovered to be a mistake, and then he begins to wreak havoc or vengeance on the person who discovered the error, namely Captain David Bowman. And that led to movies like AI by Steven Spielberg. So there's this idea, and other films where robots are supposed to have human characteristics. I find them impossible to warm up to. I don't even to call them characters is a bit of a stretch for me. But as you point out, they're not living beings. These highly maybe realistic, intelligent robots are not living beings per se.
Yeah, I think it's truer to say that they're a collection of beings that have been assembled for definite purposes, and they accomplish them very, very well. So if you look at something like an automobile, we tend to anthropomorphize it in a way. It's natural for us to do that, but we talk about it as as if it were a single entity, when really I think it's a collection of pieces of steel and plastic and rubber and so on. Now people want to say, well, aren't we the same thing? We're just a collection of cells or a collection of tissues or what have you, or of molecules. But we experience our own life and our own existence from within, and we realize we're a unified thing. It's the same me that's seeing through the eyes and that's hearing through the ears and so on.
Right.
So there you have an immediate experience of being a single being that is performing all these different activities. There's no reason to think that you've got a unity like that in the case of the car, especially since the car comes into existence from the outside. External things assemble it, whereas we actually grow. So our parts are produced from within. It's like the whole is from the beginning. So there are indications both from your own internal experience of yourself that's ongoing, and from the way we come into existence that we're one being. Yeah.
For folks who aren't familiar with the term anthropomorphize, that means give qualities of a man, right, or humanize.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of a natural tendency that we have. I'm told that the robots that are used by bomb squads, when one of those gets blown up or damaged, the bomb squad doesn't want a new robot. They want the old one fixed up because they've developed feelings of attachment to it. And I don't think that's silly or anything, but it is important to realize it's not like that thing is a living being or a single entity that put its life on the line for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a funny human foible. I reserve the right to make fun of that because it seems really superstitious. It's just assembled metal with, grids. But I suppose with that familiarity and because there's so much at stake, there's so much on the line in those highly emotional standoffs involving things like bombs, I guess it's a kind of understandable impulse. So let's move for a moment, if we can, from artificial intelligence as an alleged truncating the human person, taking out the mystery and the question of the soul out of it. We also have the animal rights movement that does not like at all the idea that we are superior to the animals. There's some terrible taboo of saying that we are superior to Fido. Can we say that animals don't have rights because they don't have duties? And yet we have a duty to not harm them or torture them and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'd say the idea that an animal has political rights, I think, is absurd unless an animal can be a citizen, in which case they should have all the citizens, they should be able to vote and so on.
And drive?
And drive.
Let's be consistent.
It's all kind of crazy. But that doesn't mean that we, as you just mentioned, that doesn't mean we don't have duties toward them, but that's because of the kind of dignity that we have in ourselves.
Yeah.
And because we're not owners and masters of the universe. It's given to us kind of on loan, you could say. We're stewards of it. We're not owners of it or lords of it. So if those things are true, that would be enough to say that we can't just do with these things as we please.
Yeah.
And I think it's also corrosive of human relationships if we're just indifferent to the suffering of animals. That's a bad thing.
Yeah.
There's the practical thing too, that being destructive of animals or the environment is finally self-destructive. We're a part of this world and we depend on it. But even aside from our dependence on it, I think it's not right that we can use it any way we want. But it doesn't follow from that the animals are our equals. That's not right. That's not required. Yeah.
One of the anecdotes you share in the book, The Immortal In You, Michael, is your brain injury, where that fire hydrant cranial contact caused some issues, and it led to some insights into the difference between the brain and its functions and the mind as the thinking intellect, because those are rather distinct, as you found out personally.
Yeah, and it's surprising how much of what we call thinking and how much of what we do, it really is the activity of the brain. And I think that partly fuels or lends credence to the materialistic claims about what our minds really are, finally. What people are surprised to find out sometimes is they're not surprised when they hear about Descartes, for example, who said your mind is purely immaterial and your body is not performing any of your activities of sensation or thinking and so on. That's not very credible, but that's an understandable position. But people are surprised to find out that long before him, Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, they both thought also that your intellectual activity, where you understand universal truths, I'm talking about in particular, is not something you do in the brain, but they also said you can't do it without your brain. It depends on your brain. That resonates with human experience, it seems to me, and it also accounts for all of the evidence of modern neuroscience that says, hey, all of your thinking is accompanied by brain activity. That's true. But the brain activity is not actually the intellectual understanding. It's acts of imagining and other similar acts that are required in order to supply your understanding with things to think about. So none of that evidence finally is something that an Aristotle or a Thomas Aquinas would have difficulty accepting.
Well, that makes a perfect segue to your anecdote about the old man in the ambulance and the difference between someone who is alive but not breathing, and someone who is deceased and not breathing. One enters upon a different precinct in the difference between even a corpse that's ventilated artificially and a corpse. So this is a roundabout way of pushing back a little bit. I wonder how Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas would answer the objection that if the intellect is quasi-independent of the brain and yet needs the brain to operate in things like imagination, then after death, when there's literally no brain, does that mean we have no intellect when after our death? See where I'm going?
Yes, right, yeah. So the kind of independence that the intellect has from the human body is that it doesn't reside in an organ of the body the way vision does, say, in the eyes and in parts of the brain. But it does depend on the brain to supply it with objects to think about. And so if there's interference with the brain, you're interfering with thinking because you're interfering with the presentation of objects. Now, I should just mention quickly that you need an argument in order to see that thing that I keep saying, that the human intellect is not in an organ of the body. And that's something that St. Thomas and Aristotle argue for, and I try to argue for in the book. But that only shows that your active thinking doesn't take place in the body, even though it depends on things in the body. Well, that means that there's a power in you, an intellectual power that also doesn't depend on the body to exist. It actually operates not in an organ. It just needs to be supplied with things to think about by the body. Mm-hmm. So after death, what do you have? Well, what you have is an intellect that still exists, or an intellectual soul that still exists. But it can no longer make use of the brain in order to have things to think about. What happens to the soul at that point? That's a place where something like pagan philosophy has to kind of go silent, or maybe make some guesses. Mm-hmm. That's where Christian faith can pick up and tell you some more, I suppose.
Well, that leads to a really tantalizing thought experiment or speculation. Namely, what about... I'm not challenging anything you just said. Let's piggyback off the truth of it. If the brain is required, the mind has to think about things that it received from the senses, like objects that relate to the eye and sounds to the ear. What about babies who die in utero, whether from abortion or from miscarriage, who never had normal, external to the mother, the sound of music, the sight of a sunset, and so on. I mean, this is speculation. Obviously, we have no access to the answer to this. But how would someone like Thomas Aquinas, or how would you grapple with that? What will their mode of thinking be like if they didn't have any sensate data as part of their experience that would enable the intellect to do its function? Do you see what I'm asking?
I do, yeah. But even in our own case, even with adults, there's nothing that you're capable of thinking about without making use of your brain, so long as your soul and your body are together. Mm-hmm. You can actually shut down all my thinking entirely by putting me under general anesthesia.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter that I've already got all kinds of ideas in my soul from my past sense experience. I can't access them as long as I'm a living body here. Mm-hmm. Without making use of my brain. So in a sense, I'm kind of in the same situation as the child in utero. What to say? If I were to die, I'm losing the use of my brain in order to be able to access or call up those ideas that I have in my mind already from past experience. So whether it's somebody that's had past experience and learned all kinds of sciences, or somebody that's learned nothing yet, when you go into the next life, when your soul is separated from your body, you can't think according to the same mode that we think in this life. According to St. Thomas, the way that you're going to think there is either you're going to sort of make use of your own understanding of intelligible things immediately. And he says that'll be very poor and confused knowledge, which is why we need the body. We naturally go with the body to help us think more clearly. Mm-hmm. Or we'll be directly informed by other purely spiritual beings, God, the angels, sort. The child that dies in utero has just as much access to God and the angels as I would.
Right.
So,
yeah, maybe more.
Yeah, probably.
Well, just thinking, obviously that close to creation, not guilty of any personal sins, especially for the infants who've been baptized and so on. That's a slightly different topic, obviously, getting ahead of pure philosophy. In your discussion, as the book goes on, The Immortal In You, you talk about the soul as this substantial form. What is the substantial form? It's not just a life principle that animates the body, is it? No.
It's not limited to human beings. That's kind of a general category of which the soul is a particular case. So a substantial form, this is language from Aristotle now, and St. Thomas, is the first thing in a set of materials, or in a material, that is the reason those materials are this kind of being as opposed to some other kind. So you're looking at a tree has a substantial form, gold has a substantial form, assuming gold is a substance and not just a collection of particles. Water has a substantial form. So your soul is an example of that sort of thing. It's the thing that's in your body's materials that makes them to be a single being, and a living human being in particular, and to be you. So of course, the moment that's gone, those materials are no longer what they were. They're not a man anymore. They're not a human being anymore.
Namely, a corpse after death, you mean?
Yeah, after death, you've got a corpse. So it's a form in general, in philosophical jargon, means what's in materials that are able to be lots of different things, but are the reason why they're this thing as opposed to something else. So even like a desk or a chair is made of wood that can be lots of other things. Well, why is it this as opposed to something else? You could say, well, a carpenter made it into this. That's an outside reason why it's this as opposed to that.
Yeah.
But an inside reason, what's in the materials themselves, that's the reason why they're a chair rather than a desk, is called its form. And in the case of a human being, that's the most unusual case of a form in all of the natural world. It's the only case where you have a form that can make materials to be a certain natural thing, but that can also exist without those materials. It's the only instance of that. Whereas God and the angels are forms that do not exist in materials at all. They're just actual substances by themselves. Mm-hmm. Other forms can't exist apart from the materials that they form.
And this substantial form, which is, it's more than just shape. I mean, I think in English, colloquially, we think of form as the shape of a thing. It's the inner form. It's a richer category. Is that the thing in me and in you and in the listeners right now, or the viewers, that allows the continuity between, blastocyst, embryo, fetus, toddler, adult? Those things look very different physically. Materially, they look rather different. And yet there's that inner coherence, and that's because of this substantial form, a.k.a. the soul. Is that a fair summary, or no?
I think that is, and that's maybe a good illustration of how it's different from shape. Maybe another example would be a caterpillar transitioning into a butterfly. If you're particularly violent and curious, if you cut open a cocoon in the middle of its development, you can pretty much pour out what was the caterpillar. It's like a liquid now. There are no organs there at a certain point. And yet we tend to think, and I think rightly, that it's not just the same species, the butterfly and the caterpillar. It's the same individual. One being once was a caterpillar, now is a butterfly. And look at the radical transition or difference in its organization over its lifespan. And yet you think you've got a single unified individual there. The cause of that is this thing called substantial form. So it's the cause of the unity and kind of being that you're looking at.
You just introduced me to a new category, violent and curious. Two intersecting circles. So I guess we're hoping the show will appeal to both the violent and the curious. Is sex ensouled? By sex, I mean gender.
Yeah, right.
Is that even settled? Is that an ongoing debate? What's the status of that in your mind?
Well, I have friends who are working on that kind of question. I think the primary difference has to be bodily, but then again, your soul fits your body. So I'm not sure that it's right to say that there's no difference between female and male souls. I'm hesitant to just make that claim.
Yeah, because here's where this is going to our Catholic listeners right now, who may be thinking about the beatified. The canonized are those who are enjoying the beatific vision right now. Yeah. They're in heaven, we say, and yet they're also they're not up the creek without a paddle, but they're not complete. The soul, because the soul is ordered to the body. So I find it hard to believe that Mother Teresa of Calcutta and St. Augustine are both just neutral, sexless souls waiting for material female and male bodies to reunite them at the end of time, respectively.
Yeah. And that goes together in general with the question, can you take any soul and put it in any body?
Right.
I don't think you can't. First of all, that's clear across species. You can't take a human soul and put it in the body of an elephant, because what a human soul does is it constitutes a human body. That's what it does when you put it in materials. That's what it does for a living, so to speak. But the same thing goes for individuals. You can't take my soul and put it in somebody else's body, if you succeeded in forming a body with my soul, you would have made me. That's what my soul does. So it doesn't lose its individuality separate from the body. Then I don't see how it would lose at least a relation to producing a body of a definite sex. Yeah.
And this is an interesting way to approach gender dysphoria, isn't it? The claim that I'm a male. Some articulate it this way: I'm a male soul animating a female body, or vice versa, and therefore I want my material physicality, my external plumbing, as it were, to reflect this inner soul identity. That's part of the deception of it, isn't it? Or the confusion there.
Yeah, things can go wrong in the body or in the brain. So, but leaving those cases aside, I think it's possible to deceive yourself. I mean, I'm not really a 6'4" man trapped in a 5'5" body. I'm just a 5'5" man.
Right.
Yeah. So I think
not just have some dignity. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about dualism, how dualism as a kind of philosophical error is with us always. It seems to be behind a lot of the moral problems that we're dealing with now. For instance, euthanasia seems to be predicated on the belief that the soul is the true person. So the real me and the real you and the real listener is just the soul. So our bodies are kind of cages into which our true selves are temporarily housed, this Neoplatonic error. How much of modern life and thinking about this is influenced by dualism?
Well, that opinion goes all the way back, as you mentioned there, to even Platonic origins, and I think what to say? There's kind of an ordinary human experience that seems to lend it credibility as well, which is that our minds go one way and our bodies seem to go another. Even when you're trying to play basketball or or when you're trying to control your desires for things, St. Paul says in Romans, hey, does this sound like you? Does this sound familiar? That I know the law, I want to behave this way, but I end up not behaving that way. You find that in Plato, that there's a kind of a conflict between the body and the soul. And that conflict is a sign of that something's unnatural, something's not the way it ought to be. But one way to read that, an easy way to read that, is that the soul and the body don't belong together, that they're not naturally united. But that's a mistake if, in fact, the soul is the form of the body and the two of them make a single living organism, a single human being. But I think it's right to say that something's gone awry. The relationship between men and women isn't quite what it was supposed to be originally. The relationship between human beings and the earth isn't quite right. And those are all indications that man's gone off track somehow. I think even Plato and Aristotle were sensitive to those strange facts. But you mentioned euthanasia. Is there a particular connection you were wondering about between euthanasia and dualism?
Yeah, it seems that this goes back to animal rights. If Fido is 18 years old and he's in great pain, the compassionate thing is to put Fido down. We'll transfer this to Grandpa. Medical professionals might say, well, that's this grandpa's shell. The real grandpa would want this, or let's speak for the real grandpa, as though the real grandpa is not a body-soul composite, is not there in the room, although incapable of communicating, whether it's from a deep coma or some other condition.
I see. I understand.
Yeah.
So I think that might be right. So they think that you can be looking at something that's alive and think it's not grandpa or whoever. And that's a mistake, because there's only one soul in you, and that soul is the cause not only of your thinking and your deliberate actions and your sensation, but it's also the cause of your vegetative functions, and it's what makes your body to be alive and to be human. So as long as you have that there, I'd say that's at the very least a strong indication that you still have the same being you had before, but it's one that's not capable of exercising all of its functions. That's what you have. It's a disabled human being.
Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. You spend some time in the book talking about different ways of understanding small e or macro evolution. Is there place in any Darwinian approach to evolution that would include the existence of the soul, or is it all materialist?
Well, I know some people, some biologists and biochemists who would say, or some Catholic ones anyway, who would say that evolution is a bad word, it means bad things. It's defined by atheism and materialism and so on, or at least by certain negations of being directed, of the evolution being directed. If that's what you mean by the word, then you have to say, well, I guess one has to reject that thing. But I find many more people seem to use the word evolution just to mean something like some species came from others, or to mean common descent, or something of that sort. And if you mean that by it, then I don't see that there's anything certainly in the Catholic understanding of Christianity that would preclude our being descended from other animals in some way or other. And what to say, but it doesn't follow from that living beings are just the products of chance or anything of that sort. I think we are the products of chance, but not just the products of chance. That's the kind of thing that I hear a little too often. People want to say, polarize the debate and say you're either the product of natural selection and so on, or you're the product of a provident God. That's a little too simple to try to reduce it to that kind of either or. It's a little bit, I compare it to saying, that's like saying you're either the product of chance events or you're the product of the choice of your parents to have a child.
Yeah.
Well, you can be both. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we can be both. So if you roll 10,000 dice, the results of those dice rolls are random, and yet God is provident. None of it was a surprise to God. But people want to glom onto the one or to the other, don't they? They don't want to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right. Yeah, so it's there's a kind of a tendency there the debate is polarized largely because people really feel very strongly about it, and they land on one side or the other, and they don't want to concede any ground to the other side. So that's part of the difficulty. Mm-hmm. But there's also, of course, a tendency to, on the one hand, maybe read Genesis as if it's describing to us kind of in movie fashion, frame by frame, what the beginning of the universe looked like, as if it's a kind of a science textbook. That leads to maybe needless opposition between believers and evolutionary science. Mm-hmm. Then on the other hand, you've got scientistic mentality that thinks, look, whatever science says is all that there is to say. Which is then very quickly leads to materialism and atheism. Sure. And that's also unjustified, and that leads to, again, needless seeming opposition between belief and evolutionary science. Yeah.
At one point in the book, you talk about natural selection and the survival of the fittest. How do you answer the objection that the term survival of the fittest is a tautology? It's like saying annual birthday or baby puppy. That the fact that those who survived are called the strongest doesn't really say what's the difference between strong and weak. It doesn't really explain things like eyesight and the development of eyes. It seems to be a statement that sounds rich and wise, but doesn't really add any, it doesn't take you forward down the avenue. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, and I think that you're right that natural selection, just considered by itself, is not supposed to be a mechanism to explain genetic novelty. It's supposed to explain why these differences over here were preserved and then reproduced, as opposed to why others were just lost. So it by itself, it can't explain much of anything. It certainly can't explain the origin of life or anything of that sort. So I think that's true, and it's worth pointing out that natural selection itself assumes, as part of its process, that you've got a being there that wants to reproduce itself and that wants to survive. So it's not going to be used as an explanation of that. Why are there beings that want to reproduce or survive at all? Natural selection has to presuppose that. It can't explain that fact.
Gotcha. This is such a rich, fascinating topic. I'm going to be rereading the book, and I'll show it up to the camera there. It's called The Immortal In You. Our guest this hour has been Dr. Michael Augros, the author of this fine book, How Human Nature is More Than Science Can Say. My gosh, look at the, in addition to little old me, Dr. Ben Weicker, Ed Feser, Peter Kraft, Brandon Vaught, all the people who are in the know and who are plugged into rich truths about who we are. It's a very important question. I love the book. Thanks for being on the show as well today, Michael. It's been an honor to connect again.
It's been a joy to be here. Thank you.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Quick reminder to you, yes, you are coming to Italy with me and Father David Genuine and 30 of your closest friends. We're only bringing one bus, okay? So this is not going to be a lengthy visitor here, this opportunity knocking on the door. So sign up now at patrickcoffin.media. We're going to go to Siena, Orvieto, Assisi, and Rome for Divine Mercy Sunday. We'll be there, papal audience with Holy Father, and Tuscan wine tasting and food, but mostly prayer at these beautiful holy sites. So, patrickcoffin.media/Italy. Be there or be rhomboid. In the meantime, be a saint. What else is there?